Let's create some metals. For this video I'm going to use a bit more complicated 3D model, and let's get started. So the first basic simple material is chrome. So let's look at a photograph of chrome. So look at this exhaust pipe. For most metals the diffuse color is pretty dark. For chrome it's probably black. And all metals have a very high reflection value. So let's try to replicate that in 3D Max. So first, let's create a new Khire material and make the diffuse color very dark. I'm going to use 1 as my lightness value. Okay. Now for chrome, you might want to set the reflections pretty high, something like 200 at least, maybe even more. Let's try 210. Some people say that metal materials don't have Fresnel reflections. Well, that is not exactly true. They have Fresnel reflections, but the value is pretty high. For metals it's about 20 to 100. I mean the index of refraction. So let's enable Fresnel reflections and set the value pretty high, like 90 for chrome. Chrome is the most reflective metal, so the reflections are the brightest. So let's try even 100. Okay, if the surface is very smooth, the reflections are perfectly sharp, almost like a mirror. Here is another photo. Look at the reflections. They're very crisp. So let's see how our material looks right now. So that's a very basic metal material, very simple to create. So for more realism you can add some slight noise to the bump slot. Look at these reflections, they are not perfectly straight. There's a slight wave to this line here. So let's try adding a simple noise map to the bump slot. Go to the maps, bump, and select noise. Let's try something like 20 for now. Set the bump value pretty low. And let's re-render. A bit too low. Let's increase it to 6. You might have to adjust the size of your bump map depending on the object. Let's see. I'm going to re-render this region where we can see the reflection clearly. And I'm going to try a different bump size. Let's try 60. So this is too large. The effect is not seen at all. So now let's try 5. Maybe even lower, like 1. Okay, so this is better. Let's make the bump a bit weaker. Let's try 2 or 3. Okay, pretty good. Now have a slight wave to the reflections. In the real world, it's very rare that the surface is perfectly smooth. It usually has a slight wave, slight noise. Okay, so that's our chrome material. So let's rename it to chrome. Okay, let's copy our chrome material to another slot and rename it to stainless steel. So the main difference is, look at this photograph. So the diffuse looks a bit lighter, the reflections are a bit weaker, and they are not as perfectly sharp as on the chrome. So let's adjust this material. First assign it to our object, and now let's make the changes. So first of all, let's increase the diffuse color to a bit brighter, for example 8. Now let's reduce the reflections a bit. Let's try 180, and reduce the Fresnel IOR as well. Okay, the last step is reducing reflection glossiness to 0. Let's try 96 and re-render. So you can see the overall appearance is a bit lighter. It's not as reflective as chrome, and that's basically the only difference from chrome. Okay. You can also create a matte version of stainless steel by reducing the glossiness value a bit further. So let's copy it to another slot. Rename. And let's try a lower glossiness value. Let's try 85. So for metals, I would suggest you use the Ward BRDF model. Look at the reflections in this material. So this is with Ward, and this is with the default blend shader. So the Ward is much shinier, much more blurred, and so it's suggested to use this model for metals. Let's try to render. Okay, first assign. So that's a matte stainless steel. You can make an aluminum material from this pretty easily. So copy this material to another slot. Okay, first let's look at aluminum. So here's the aluminum tray. You can see that the diffuse color is even brighter, and the reflections are even more blurred. So let's try to increase diffuse color. Let's try 20, 25 perhaps. And reduce the glossiness to 0.8. Okay, assign and render. So that's a nice aluminum material. So now let's move on to colored metals. So here are some different examples of colored metals. So the main difference is in the reflect color and the diffuse color. Most importantly, the reflect color. So since the diffuse color is so dark, the main color of the object is determined by the reflection color. So for example, if you want to create a copper material, you should set the reflections as this orange red color. So let's try to do just that. Copy the stainless steel material to another slot. Rename to copper. And change the reflect color to something like this. Look at the reference image and try to match the main color here. Okay, so it's a bit more pink. Something like that. Okay. Now the diffuse color should be a bit darker. I'm looking at the darkest spot on this material and trying to determine the color of it. So it's pretty dark and it has a slight reddish tint. So let's try something like this. Render. So this looks pretty much like copper. So to make different colored metals, you simply change the reflect color and adjust the diffuse color slightly. So for example, let's try to make brass now. Copy to another slot and rename to brass. So let's look at the photo again. It's kind of yellow, a bit orangey, something like probably like this. And it's also darker than our copper. So let's reduce the reflection value as well. Okay. Now try to look at the darkest part of this material, and so it's very dark yellow green color, a bit lighter than for the copper, probably something like this. Let's try and see how it looks. Okay, so it's a bit more blurred than copper. Let's reduce the reflection glossiness a little bit. And I think that's a good brass material here. Okay. Now let's try to make something like this. It's pretty dark. The reflections are not even. You can see some color variation to it. And there is a weird scratch pattern on it. So let's copy our brass material, name it to metal dark, and let's try to make something like this. So first, let's adjust our diffuse color. So it's patchy, so we might want to use the noise map with something like this color, and perhaps something darker. So let's try noise. Set one color to dark gray, and the other one a bit lighter, something yellow-green, like this. Okay, now let's reduce the size of noise. So let's re-render this small region here to see the changes. Okay, first let's change the noise to a bit more contrasty version so we can see the changes better. Just so we can adjust the noise size correctly. So it's probably too large. Let's try 5. Okay, just for testing purposes, let's turn down the reflection value to 0, just so we can see the diffuse better. So the noise is still a bit too large. Let's try 2. Okay, now it's a bit too small. So let's leave it at 4. Okay. Let's change the colors back to what they were. Something like this. Okay, now let's add some reflections. Copy the noise map from the diffuse slot and paste into the reflect slot. Now go in and change the colors like this. So we want the darkest parts to be reflective and the lightest parts to be less reflective. So what we're gonna do, we're gonna swap the colors around like this. So it's probably a bit more desaturated than in our rendering. Let's turn it a bit up and reduce the saturation like this. Getting closer, a bit too desaturated. Okay, I guess something like this should work. Let's go up and reduce the reflection glossiness. First change the BRDF to word and reduce the glossiness to 0.88. Okay. I think we should reduce the Fresnel IOR as well to 30. Okay, now let's try to simulate the scratch pattern. So we have a noise map in our bump slot. Let's mix it with a scratchy bitmap. So click on the noise, choose mix, and keep the old map as submap. Now into the second slot we will use this map. It's in the dirt maps. I think it's scratch 1. Turn on show in viewport for a nice preview. And looks like we should increase the tiling a bit. Let's try 2 by 2. Okay, now let's mix the noise with scratch. Add like 80, so the scratch is stronger. And increase the bump value to 30. Good. Now I think that the diffuse color is a bit too light. So I will try to reduce this second color in the noise of the diffuse map. Like this. Let's try. A bit closer. So what I want to try is increasing the reflection glossiness a bit. Our example is a bit shinier. Let's try 0.9. Still needs some adjustments. Okay, let's increase the reflection color a bit, just for some stronger highlights. And I'm going to add this patina here by using the V-Ray blend material. So first let's render it as it is now. Now let's change the material type to V-Ray blend material. What I want to do is add these darker areas that are not as reflective in the inner corners of the object. So to do that, first change the material type to V-Ray blend material and keep the old material as submaterial. So next we're going to copy it to the coat material slot and make it much less reflective. Reduce the reflection value and the saturation as well. Let's reduce the diffuse color as well. So a very dark desaturated material here, like this. So now we want to blend it with our base material, but only in the inner corner parts. So let's see how it looks right now. So this is a simple blend without using any maps, and the result is not exactly what I'm looking for. So I'm going to use a V-Ray dirt map as the blend amount. So how this works: the white color in this map shows the coat color, the coat material. The black color in this map shows the base material. So I want to set the occluded color to white. So the occluded areas will show the darker material. So I think these parts should become darker. And unoccluded color as black. So let's try it with the radius of 10. And let's increase the strength of our V-Ray dirt map. So first increase the subdues for a smoother result, and now copy the V-Ray dirt map from this slot and paste into the unoccluded color slot. Go deeper and paste again. This should give our V-Ray dirt map enough strength to show a nice result. So let's try to render. And I think this looks much better. We could probably even increase the V-Ray dirt radius to 20. I think this is close enough. So let's compare it to our original material, and here's with the blend version. Much more interesting here. Notice how the render time has increased almost 3 times. Okay. Okay, here's an interesting example. Antique silver. So the principles to create antique silver are pretty similar to what we just did with this material. So first we got to create the base silver material. Let's use our stainless steel to do that. So copy it to another slot, rename to silver. And basically silver has a bit lighter diffuse color. Maybe make it a bit warmer. And the reflect color is a bit warmer as well. Just a little bit. It's probably a bit shinier as well. Okay. So this should be a pretty basic silver material. So this is very basic, very boring. Now let's create antique silver. So cancel the render. And copy to another slot. Name to silver antique. And now let's look at this image. So all the deeper parts are pretty dark. The reflections are quite uneven. Let's look at another example here. It is pretty shiny, and the glossiness is not equal as well. So let's do it step by step. First, let's change the glossiness to a bitmap. Let's try something like this. To make the effect weaker, we can reduce the amount of texture in reflection glossiness slot, and this will mix it with the value we have put in there. That's 0.96. So first change the BRDF to word, like for all metals, and now reduce the reflection glossiness value. Try 1, 2, 5, maybe 10. Okay, 10 looks like it should work. Now let's use the same map and mix it with our bump mix it with the noise map in bump slot. So change it to mix, keep old map as set map, and paste an instance in the second slot. Let's try to mix it at 50. Okay, let's try a higher bump value, like this. So that's the first step. So you can notice that the deep parts have a dark diffuse color as well. So to do that, we're going to use the V-Ray dirt map in our diffuse slot. So set up a V-Ray dirt map. Let's reduce the radius to 5 and copy the diffuse color to the unoccluded color slot. Okay. Increase subdivs for smooth results and copy the V-Ray dirt map and paste it into itself's unoccluded color slot. Let's do it a couple of times just to get a stronger effect. Okay. Let's look at our material now. So it looks pretty nice. Now we need to add the dark parts in the deep slots. So with this material we use the V-Ray dirt map in the blend amount slot and use the V-Ray blend material. For this silver I'm going to use another approach. We can simply use a V-Ray dirt map in our reflect slot. So set up a V-Ray dirt map in the reflect slot. Okay, let's leave the radius at 10. Occluded color as black or not reflective at all, and unoccluded color as something like 200 and a bit warmer, like this. Increase the subdivs. Now copy the V-Ray dirt map and paste into the unoccluded color slot. Okay, now this should give us the results we want. So this is pretty nice. I think maybe the diffuse color is too gray and too dark. So let's change the V-Ray dirt parameters for the diffuse map. So I don't want to change it for every V-Ray dirt layer, so I'm going to go to the deepest one, cut the V-Ray dirt map, go back to the material base and paste into the diffuse slot. Now I have only one V-Ray dirt map in the diffuse slot, and I'm going to adjust the colors of the unoccluded color. So first I'll make it lighter and give it a bit more saturation like this. Okay. Now copy it and create the layers back. Let's re-render this little region here just to see the changes. So I think this should be pretty good for the silver material. For all the metals with blurred reflections, you might want to increase the material reflection subdivs for the final renders if you want a nice, clean, noiseless result. So if you set it to a higher number like 16 or 32, the reflection should be cleaner. Okay, let's move on. Now let's try to create a gold leaf material. So here's one sample. Here's another. Here's a cabinet covered with gold leaf. Okay, and here's a freshly leafed bell or dome. So what we want to do first is find some gold leaf images on Google image search. Okay, let's try the large size. So this should be pretty nice. Not much here. Let's try gold foil. Okay, let's try to do it with this image. So copy it, go to Photoshop and create a new image. Paste your texture and desaturate it. Okay. Now let's use the curves tool to increase the contrast. Perfect. So let's make the image smaller. Let's try 600. Copy everything. Increase the canvas size by 100% in both directions. And paste. So this is one example when we want the seams visible. So let's rotate a couple of these just so they don't look the same. Maybe flip one around. Rotate. Okay. I think that's good. Merge the layers together and create a new layer on top of it. So let's paint in some dark borders. Choose a black color and select a brush tool. Increase the size and reduce the hardness. Drawing lines like this. Okay, let's blur it. And reduce the opacity. Like this. Okay, now copy. First merge down and copy everything. Now increase the canvas size again by 100%. Paste and move to the corners. Rotate the copies around. Okay, merge everything together. Now let's open up one of our dirt maps. I'm going to use this one here. Copy everything, go back to this image and paste on top of our texture. Move to the corner and transform so that it fills the whole area. Now just cycle through the blend modes until you see an interesting result. Okay, like this one, I'm going to decrease the opacity, like this. Perfect. Now let's save this texture as gold leaf. So let's create the gold leaf material. Let's use our brass material to do that. Copy it to another slot and rename to gold leaf. So first set the diffuse color to something like dark green yellow, maybe like this. Okay, so set the reflect color to pretty bright yellow. And increase the Fresnel IOR as well. Let's try 70. So I'll change the BRDF to word and mix my bump map with the texture we just created. So let's preview it on our model and increase the tiling like this. Maybe a bit less, like 3 by 3. So set the mix amount at 80. So the gold leaf texture is dominant over the noise, and increase the bump value. I think it needs more contrast, so let's do that in Photoshop. Simply use the curves tool to increase the contrast. Okay, let's undo. Increase the contrast only for the gold leaf layer. Like this. Now save. And check the result. Okay. Let's try a quick render. So the squares are not too apparent. Let's add some seams perhaps. Let's create a new layer here and use the brush tool with high hardness and a very small size to draw lines like these. I guess the size is a bit too small. Let's try 5 pixels. Okay, so let's try to make these a bit less regular. So let's open another dirt map. For example, this one. Copy, paste here, and increase the size like this. So let's increase the contrast. And try some blending modes. Like this. Great. And merge down. Okay, undo. What we're going to do is copy merged and hide these layers. So unhide those below and paste. Now set the line blending mode to darken, and we have our broken lines on top of the texture. Okay, let's save. And try again. So you can see the seams a bit better now. Let's just do one final adjustment. Let's try to use our texture in the reflection glossiness slot. Just copy it from the noise, from the mix map, and paste in the reflection glossiness slot. Okay, so here's the result. It's way too strong. So bring up the reflection glossiness value and let's mix it with the reflection glossiness texture. Let's try 50. And re-render. So this looks pretty decent gold foil. Let's try to increase the tiling to see the effect better. Very nice, you can see the little squares here. Looks like a real gold foil. Maybe the reflections are a bit too blurry, but you can fix that easily by reducing the reflection glossiness map value to, let's say, 20. So play around with the reflection glossiness value to get a result that you like. I'm going to leave it at 20 for now. Okay, let's move on to the next material. What I'm going to show you next is how to make a hammered metal. So here's an example with hammered steel, and inside you can see the hammered copper. So there are two ways to make this effect. You take your basic metal material and just simply add a bump map. So you can use a texture you could draw in Photoshop, or you can use a simple cellular map from the 3D Max procedural maps. So let's try to make hammered copper. create a new copy, rename, and assign to our object. Go to the bump slot and clear it. Now assign a cellular map here and preview it in the viewport. So here's how it looks. Let's try to reduce the size. And invert the colors. Okay, no good. Let's move the colors back. So basically what we want to create is small cells that are bumped inwards. So let's try to set our bump as negative value. Let's try -10. Render. So you can see an uneven surface now, pretty much like it would be hammered. If you wish, you can make it stronger by increasing the negative bump value to, let's say, -30. So this is a very nice hammered metal material. Very simple to create, and you can use this bump map on any metal material, increase the size of hammering, increase the strength by changing the bump value. Very simple. Okay. Let's create one more material. So let's try to recreate this scratched iron. So first things first. Basically we could try to create a V-Ray blend material because there are two distinct materials here. First is the black material with low reflection value and very blurry reflections, and the second is this light regular scratched steel. So first let's create a V-Ray blend material. Now let's create a base material. Again, choose V-Ray material and set up the diffuse color as a very dark color, something like this. Increase the reflections a little bit, enable Fresnel and set it to something like 20. Okay, reduce the reflection glossiness. You can see that it's pretty blurred, and I think the reflections are too strong. Let's try something lower like this. So this would be our base. Increase the subdues to get the smoother reflection blurring. Okay, so now we have our base. Let's create the coat material. Actually, let's just copy this matte stainless steel material to our coat material slab. Make a copy. And let's use a V-Ray dirt map as our blend amount. Okay. So what I want to do is swap the occluded color and unoccluded color around. And now I want the occluded color to come from the outer edges. So you can notice that the outer edges are scratched the most. So to swap from the inner edges to outer edges, choose invert normal option. Okay, and now let's use a bitmap as a radius map. Well, to simulate the scratches, we're going to use something like this. Preview it on the model. Well, this is not scratchy enough. Maybe let's try this one here. Okay. So let's invert it, so the dark parts are visible and light parts are not visible. And increase the contrast. Okay. Now let's copy the V-Ray dirt map and create a few layers of it, just to make the effect stronger. And let's see what we got. So this is not too bad, but I think I'm going to increase the radius a bit, just to increase the area of effect. So let's try 25. Just go through all the layers and change the radius to 25. And re-render. So this is a very simple way how to create a scratched metal, scratched iron. So you don't have to create special textures for every object. It calculates the scratched parts automatically by using the procedural V-Ray dirt map. You can experiment with different radius maps to get different effects. Now I'm going to show you a little trick on how to create a super shiny gold material. So look at this reference photo here. As you can see, the reflections are pretty sharp and they also appear pretty shiny, with some blurred reflections going on there as well. So how do we create that? Pretty simple. We're going to use two materials, one with sharp reflections and one with blurred, and blend them together with V-Ray blend material. So let's create a new V-Ray blend material. And let's create the base material now. Okay, let's set up a basic gold material, dark greenish diffuse color, something like in this region over here. I think it's like this. And the yellow reflect color. Make it pretty bright, as the gold is very reflective. Okay, so let's change the BRDF to word for more shinier reflections. Enable Fresnel. For gold we would use something like probably 70. And let's reduce the glossiness just a tiny bit. Let's try 0.98 or 0.99. Okay, so that's gonna be our base material. So let's increase the subdues for smoother result, and let's see how it looks. So this is a pretty decent basic gold material. It renders pretty fast. And it's normally fine for use in your scenes. But when you need that special golden glow, you might want to add the second material to it, the coat. So let's wait for it to render. Here it is. This is fine for normal use. Let's save it. And now let's create the second version. So go up. Okay, first let's copy our bump map from the chrome material we created earlier and paste it into the bump slot of our gold material. So adding a slight noise to metal materials is a good idea in general. Just a very low value. Okay, so now go up to the View and Blend material and copy the first base material to the coat material slot. Okay, now go to the coat material and set up the reflection glossiness as 0.8. So maybe let's change the color a little bit. A bit less saturated and a bit more to the orange hue. Okay, something like this. So let's leave the blending as it is at 50% and let's see how it looks now. And there you have it, a nice rich looking gold material. Look at the render time. Now compare it to our previous version with a single gold layer. So it went up from almost 2 minutes to 5.5. This is pretty hard to render. Takes a longer time, but the results look pretty nice. So I'm going to show you how to create something similar but get a faster render time. So copy the base material to another slot. And now this is a fake version. So unlink the highlight glossiness and reduce it. This way you can get a similar result, but the V-Ray will not be calculating the reflections for the shiny areas. It will only be using specular. So let's try it out. And here is our quick render. Let's save it and compare to the previous version. Okay, 5.5 minutes and 1 minute 47 seconds. So this obviously looks nicer and you have a greater control. You can change the reflect color on the second layer, you can change the reflection intensity and so on. But this is a nice way to get a similar effect much faster. Okay, so I guess that's it for metals.